The sound of my car's engine echoed through the garage, a mechanical groan that seemed to lament its imminent failure. I was about to leave for an important meeting when the car decided not to cooperate. Feeling a mixture of frustration and despair, I picked up the phone and called the nearest garage. A few minutes later, a pickup truck pulled into my driveway. It was then that I saw him for the first time. Jack stepped out of the vehicle with unwavering confidence, his blue eyes fixed on me, as if they already knew something I didn't. The tension in the air was palpable. He walked over to me, and for a moment, I felt the world stop. "You must be Anna," he said, with a smile that made my heart beat faster. "Let's see what we've got here." As he inspected the engine, I tried to stay calm. But there was something in the way he moved, in the intensity of his gaze, that made me uneasy. "I think I found the problem," Jack announced, lifting a tool that looked ordinary, but which he handled with an almost hypnotic dexterity. "You'll need a new part." I tried to concentrate on his words, but the closeness between us was intoxicating. "Can you fix it now?" I asked, my voice coming out shakier than I would have liked. He nodded, and I watched as he worked, his every movement charged with a sensuality I had never noticed in a mechanic before. When he had finished, he handed me the car key, and our fingers touched for a brief second. It was as if an electric current ran through me. I took a step back, trying to ignore the sensation. "Thanks, Jack. How much do I owe you?" He smiled again, a smile that made my legs go weak. "Don't worry about it now. We can work it out later." I knew there was something else behind his words, something that pulled me irresistibly towards him. Trying to keep my composure, I thanked him once more and got into the car. As I drove to my meeting, I couldn't get Jack out of my head. The tension, the touch, the steady gaze. I knew I was playing with fire, but the temptation was impossible to resist. And at that moment, a part of me already knew that this unexpected encounter was just the beginning of something that would change my life forever. As Jack leaned over the engine of my car, explaining what was wrong, his arm accidentally brushed mine. It was a simple, harmless touch, but I felt as if an electric current had run through my body. My heart raced, and for a moment, I lost concentration on what he was saying. "Here, you can see that the strap is frayed," said Jack, pointing with a screwdriver. His deep voice and the closeness of his body made it difficult to focus on the belt or anything else. Our gazes met, and in that instant, I realized that he felt the same way. There was a fire in his eyes, a desire that mirrored my own. I felt a lump in my throat and looked away, trying to regain my composure. "Ah, yes, I see," I replied, trying to sound interested in what he was saying, but my mind was racing. How could such a simple touch cause such confusion within me? Jack moved closer, his arm touching mine again, this time on purpose. The warmth of his skin against mine was intoxicating. He was so close that I could feel his breath on my neck. My whole body was reacting to his presence. "You know, I started to speak, but my voice failed me. I didn't know what to say. I was lost between guilt and desire." He didn't wait for me to finish. Suddenly, his hands were on my face, his lips on mine. It was a stolen kiss, unexpected, but so full of passion that it left me breathless. My body reacted automatically, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The world around us disappeared. There was just the two of us, in that moment, in that garage. When we finally broke apart, we were panting. I looked at him, his eyes still shining with desire, and I knew I was lost. How could I resist something so intense? "I shouldn't," I started to say, but he interrupted me with another kiss, softer this time, but just as charged with emotion. "I know," he whispered against my lips, "but I can't help it. I couldn't help it either. I knew it was wrong, that I had a husband at home who trusted me, who loved me. But at that moment, all that seemed distant, almost unreal. The only thing that seemed real was Jack, and how I felt about him. When we finally pulled away, I tried to regain my composure. I ran my hand through my hair, trying to put my thoughts in order. "We need to stop," I said, more to myself than to him. "We can't do this." He just looked at me, a smile playing on his lips. "Maybe we can't, but that doesn't mean we don't want to," he replied, his voice laden with certainty. I had no answer to that. I knew he was right. What I wanted and what was right were two completely different things. And at that moment, desire seemed much stronger than guilt. "I have to go," I finally said, taking a step back. "Of course," he replied, but there was an unspoken promise in his eyes. We knew it wouldn't end there. I left the garage, my heart still beating uncontrollably. Guilt began to creep in, mixed with desire. How could I face David after that? How could I look at him in the evening, over dinner, knowing what had happened? But even as these thoughts haunted me, a part of me longed for the next meeting with Jack. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't help it. Jack's touch, his kiss, the electricity between us. It was all so addictive. When I got home, David was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He smiled when he saw me, that warm smile I always loved. Guilt hit me like a punch in the stomach, but I managed to force a smile back. "Hi, love," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi, how was your day?" he asked, without suspecting a thing. "It was normal," I lied, feeling the weight of betrayal in every word. During dinner, I tried to concentrate on the conversation, but my mind kept going back to Jack, to the touch of his skin against mine, to the stolen kiss. Every time my phone vibrated with a message, my heart raced, hoping it was him. After dinner, while David was doing the dishes, I picked up my phone and saw a message from Jack. "I can't stop thinking about you," it said. I felt a shiver run down my spine and, for a moment, I considered ignoring the message, but the temptation was too strong. "Me too," I replied, knowing I was entering dangerous territory. The messages between us got bolder and bolder, more and more full of desire. Every time I looked at David, the guilt intensified, but the desire for Jack grew even more. I knew I had to make a decision, but for now I was caught between guilt and desire, unable to resist the temptation that Jack represented. I was sitting at the dinner table next to David, my husband. The food tasted bland, and each bite was a reminder of the guilt that consumed me. David was talking about his day at work, but I could barely pay attention. My mind was stuck on Jack, the mechanic who had appeared in my life so unexpectedly. "Are you all right, darling?" David asked, snapping me out of my daydreams. "I'm fine, just a bit tired," I replied, forcing a smile, trying to hide the turmoil going on inside me. In truth, my mind was far away, remembering Jack's touch, the electricity that ran through my body when our hands accidentally met on the side of the car. It was a forbidden touch, but charged with an intensity I had never felt before. As David continued talking, my cell phone vibrated discreetly in my pocket. I knew it was a message from Jack. Since that first encounter in the garage, our conversations had become increasingly bold. I slid my hand under the table and picked up the phone, opening the message with a nervousness that made my heart beat faster. "I can't stop thinking about you. I need to see you again." My eyes fixed on the screen, and I felt a mixture of guilt and desire. I knew I was cheating on David, but at the same time, the attraction to Jack was irresistible. I answered quickly, before David realized. "Me too. When can we meet?" David looked at me, and I quickly put the phone back in my pocket, trying to disguise it. "Is everything all right?" he asked again. Yeah, sorry. I'm just a bit distracted, I lied, feeling the weight of guilt grow even heavier. Later that night, while David slept next to me, I tossed and turned in bed, unable to find peace. My mind was occupied with Jack's messages. Guilt was eating away at me, but the desire to see him again was stronger. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. The next day, I found an excuse to leave the house and went to Jack's workshop. The nervousness was palpable as I approached. When I entered, he was there, working on a car. His eyes lit up at the sight of me, and he put down his tools, walking towards me. The sexual tension between us was almost unbearable. I knew you'd come, he said, with a smile that was both charming and dangerous. I couldn't stop thinking about you, I admitted, my voice trembling. Jack moved closer, his fingers lightly brushing my arm. Me too, he whispered, and at that moment, all my self-control crumbled. We kissed right there, in the workshop, amid the smell of oil and metal. It was a kiss full of passion, desire, and a sense of freedom that I had never experienced before. As we pulled away, panting, he held my face between his hands. I know this is wrong, but I can't stay away from you. Me neither, I admitted, feeling guilt mixed with excitement. I knew I was cheating on David, but at the same time, the attraction to Jack was irresistible. When I got home, the remorse hit me hard. David was in the living room, watching TV, and I felt like a complete imposter. We sat down to dinner, and every bite was a reminder of my betrayal. David was a good man, and I knew he didn't deserve this. You seem distant lately, he commented, looking at me with concern. I'm sorry, I just have a lot on my mind, I lied, trying to hide the truth. That night, lying next to David, I felt torn. Part of me wanted to confess everything and get rid of the guilt, but the other part couldn't stay away from Jack. His messages kept coming, more and more boldly, and I answered them with my heart racing. I can't stay away from you any longer. We need to meet again, he wrote. I agreed, knowing that I was sinking deeper and deeper into an abyss from which it would be difficult to escape. I was caught between guilt and desire, and every meeting with Jack made the situation more complicated. The next day, I found an excuse to leave the house and went to Jack's workshop. The nervousness was palpable as I approached. When I entered, he was there, working on a car. His eyes lit up at the sight of me, and he put down his tools, walking towards me. The sexual tension between us was almost unbearable. I knew you'd come, he said, with a smile that was both charming and dangerous. I couldn't stop thinking about you, I admitted, my voice trembling. Jack moved closer, his fingers lightly brushing my arm. Me too, he whispered, and at that moment, all my self-control crumbled. We kissed right there, in the workshop, amid the smell of oil and metal. It was a kiss full of passion, desire, and a sense of freedom that I had never experienced before. As we pulled away, panting, he held my face between his hands. I know this is wrong, but I can't stay away from you. Me neither, I admitted, feeling guilt mixed with excitement. I knew I was cheating on David, but at the same time, the attraction to Jack was irresistible. When I got home, the remorse hit me hard. David was in the living room, watching TV, and I felt like a complete imposter. We sat down to dinner, and every bite was a reminder of my betrayal. David was a good man, and I knew he didn't deserve this. You seem distant lately, he commented, looking at me with concern. I'm sorry, I just have a lot on my mind, I lied, trying to hide the truth. That night, lying next to David, I felt torn. Part of me wanted to confess everything and get rid of the guilt, but the other part couldn't stay away from Jack. His messages kept coming, more and more boldly, and I answered them with my heart racing. "I can't stay away from you any longer. We need to meet again," he wrote. I agreed, knowing that I was sinking deeper and deeper into an abyss from which it would be difficult to escape. I was caught between guilt and desire, and every encounter with Jack made the situation more complicated. The dilemma between stability with David and the overwhelming passion for Jack consumed me. Every moment with David was torture, a constant reminder of my betrayal. But at the same time, I longed for every message, every forbidden encounter with Jack. I knew I was at a crossroads, and the decision I made would change everything. As we exchanged more messages, planning our next meeting, I felt more and more involved. My desire for Jack was uncontrollable, but guilt was eating away at me. I was trapped in a cycle of guilt and desire, and every day the decision became more unbearable. I knew that eventually I would have to choose, but for now I was lost in a sea of conflicting emotions, living a double life that seemed impossible to sustain. The second time I went to Jack's workshop, my heart felt like it wanted to burst out of my chest. My mind was torn between excitement and guilt. The parking lot was practically empty, and the only light came from the workshop where Jack worked. I parked the car and got out, my hands sweating and my legs shaking. When I walked in, Jack was leaning over the engine of a car, his skilled hands fiddling with the parts. When he saw me, he looked up, and a mischievous smile formed on his lips. "You're back," he said, putting down his tools and walking towards me. I began, but my voice failed me. I needed him, that's what I wanted to say, but I couldn't. He moved closer, and the sexual tension between us was almost unbearable. Jack put a hand on my waist and pulled me closer, and I could feel the warmth of his body. "I needed you too," he murmured, his eyes fixed on mine. I knew I was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. But at that moment, the only thing that mattered was desire. Jack kissed me, an urgent kiss full of passion. I couldn't resist. My mind was screaming at me to stop, but my body wouldn't obey. "This is crazy," I whispered, still between his lips. "Sometimes madness is exactly what we need," he replied, and I felt a shiver run through my body. Jack's touch was electrifying. Every time his hands met my skin, it was as if an electric current ran through me. He lifted me up and placed me on the hood of a car, his lips never leaving mine. My hands explored his body, feeling every muscle, every contour. "You're beautiful," he said, pulling away just enough to look into my eyes. "And I want you now." I couldn't say anything. I just nodded and pulled him back to me. Unbridled passion consumed us. The workshop, with its smell of oil and metal, became our refuge, a place where reality didn't matter. I discovered that the pleasure in taking risks was intoxicating. Every moment with Jack was a mixture of fear and excitement, and I couldn't get enough. His touches, his kisses, everything was intensified by the danger of being discovered. After it was all over, we lay on the hood of the car, panting. Jack ran his hand through my hair, and I closed my eyes, trying to record every detail of that moment. "You know this is just the beginning, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and husky. "I know," I replied, opening my eyes and looking at him. "And I don't mind." I left the workshop feeling like I was living a double life. Guilt and desire mixed in my mind, but I knew I wouldn't be able to stop. Jack was a temptation I couldn't resist, and the discovery of the pleasure in taking risks was addictive. As I drove home, I thought about David. How could I look at him and pretend that nothing was happening? How could I live this lie? But at the same time, the memory of Jack's touch, his kisses, his passion, was what kept me going. I was torn between two worlds, and I didn't know how to get out of this crossroads. Getting home and facing David was a challenge, He was in the living room, reading a book, and looked at me with a smile when I came in. "How was your day?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the book. "Good," I replied, trying to sound natural. "And yours?" "Quiet," he replied, unaware of the storm raging inside me. I went into the bedroom, and the first thing I did was pick up my cell phone. There was a message from Jack. "I can't stop thinking about you." An involuntary smile formed on my lips, and I replied, "Me too. When can we see each other again?" The answer came almost instantly. "Soon, I promise." I turned off my cell phone and lay down on the bed, my mind still reeling from the day's events. It was clear that this story was far from over. The decision to continue with Jack, regardless of the consequences, had already been made. Whatever came next, I knew I was prepared to face it. I never imagined it would be so difficult to keep my composure at home with David. Every time I looked at him, my heart squeezed with guilt. But at the same time, my mind was invaded by constant fantasies about Jack. It was torture. During everyday moments, like washing the dishes or taking a shower, I would find myself imagining Jack's touch, his intense gaze, his firm hands. Even excuses to spend more time away from home became routine. "I need to work late today. I'm meeting a friend for coffee. I need to sort something out downtown." David seemed to accept all my excuses without question, but I sensed that he was beginning to notice something strange. It was on one of these excuses that I arranged a secret meeting with Jack in the city parking lot. My heart was racing as I drove there. When I arrived, I saw Jack leaning against his car, with that provocative smile that left me breathless. "You came," he said, approaching me. "I couldn't stay away," I replied, feeling a shiver run down my spine. He pulled me into a tight hug, and for a moment, I forgot everything. I forgot about David, the guilt, the risk. There was only Jack, and the overwhelming desire he aroused in me. "I've been thinking about you a lot," he whispered in my ear, making my body tremble. "Me too," I admitted, feeling the heat rise to my face. We kissed there, in the middle of the parking lot, not caring if anyone could see us. The adrenaline of being in a public place, the danger of being discovered, only increased the intensity of the moment. His hands explored my body urgently, and I knew I wouldn't be able to resist for long. "We need to go somewhere more discreet," he suggested, breaking off the kiss. I agreed, trying to catch my breath. We got into his car and drove to a remote motel. Every second seemed like an eternity, but we finally arrived. As soon as the room door closed behind us, the sexual tension became unbearable. We undressed in a hurry, as if our clothes were barriers that needed to be removed as quickly as possible. Unbridled passion overtook us. Every touch, every kiss, every movement was charged with desire and urgency. It was as if we were trying to make up for all the time we'd spent away from each other. And at that moment, everything seemed to make sense. The pleasure of taking risks, the excitement of living something forbidden, was addictive. Then, lying on the bed, still panting, Jack looked at me with a satisfied smile. "You're amazing," he said, stroking my cheek. "You too," I replied, feeling a mixture of happiness and guilt. I knew that when I got home, I would have to face David again, and that broke my heart. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Jack and what else we could do together. Every secret meeting was an escape from reality, a chance to be myself without judgment. When I got home, I found David in the living room, watching TV. He looked at me and smiled, without suspecting a thing. My heart ached as I realized how much he trusted me. "How was your day?" he asked, turning off the TV. "Tiring, but productive," I lied, trying to sound natural. "Good. I made your favorite dinner," he said, getting up to hug me. I felt a lump in my throat as I hugged him. The guilt was overwhelming, but the desire for Jack was still strong. I knew I wouldn't be able to stop. I was stuck in a double routine, torn between two worlds and two men. And as much as it hurt, I didn't want it to end. When I started getting emotionally involved with Jack, everything became even more complicated. At first, I thought it was just a physical attraction, something fleeting. But as time went by, I realized that I was fooling myself. The conversations with Jack went beyond desire. There was a deep connection that was established with each encounter. One sunny afternoon, after another furtive encounter in the workshop, Jack looked me in the eye and said, "You know this isn't just about sex, right? I feel like we're connecting in a way I never imagined." My heart raced. I knew he was right. With Jack, I felt free, light. I felt I could be who I really was, without masks. It was a feeling of freedom that I hadn't experienced for a long time. David, my husband, was a good man, but our relationship had become monotonous, predictable. With Jack, everything was intense, exciting. "I feel the same way," I replied, trying to contain the emotion in my voice. "But that makes it even more complicated, Jack. I'm married. I have a life with David." Jack came closer, held my face gently, and said, "I understand, but I can't deny how I feel about you. And I don't think you can either." I returned home that evening with a whirlwind of emotions. Dinner with David was painful. Guilt consumed me. I knew that my relationship with him was changing, that I was drifting apart. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Jack. All the moments we spent together, all the conversations, the touches, the kisses. Everything was so intense, so real. During dinner, David noticed my strange behavior. "Are you all right, darling? You seem distant." I forced a smile, trying to disguise my discomfort. "I'm fine, just a bit tired from work." The nights were even harder. Lying next to David, my mind wandered to Jack. The text messages we exchanged became more and more daring. He teased me, made me feel wanted, alive. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I couldn't stop. One evening, after a long exchange of messages, Jack called me. "I need to see you tomorrow. I can't stand being away from you any longer." "I want to see you too, but I don't know if I can leave the house without arousing suspicion." "Make something up. Say you're going to the market, that you're going to see a friend. Anything, but come and see me." I agreed, despite the fear and guilt I felt. The next day, I made up some excuse for David and went to Jack's workshop. The tension between us was almost unbearable. As soon as we entered the back room, he pulled me into a passionate kiss. Every touch, every caress, seemed to set my skin on fire. "I don't know what's going to happen to us, but I don't want to stop," I said, panting between kisses. "Neither do I. I just want to enjoy every moment with you," Jack replied, looking at me with an intensity that made me shiver. With each meeting, the emotional intimacy between us grew. We talked about our lives, our fears, our dreams. With him, I could be vulnerable. I could be myself, and that was liberating. On the other hand, the guilt only increased. Every time I looked at David, I felt a pang of remorse. He didn't deserve that. But the desire to be with Jack was stronger. I found myself trapped in a dilemma with no way out. I wanted to run away with Jack, to leave everything behind, but I knew it wasn't that simple. "Why don't we leave everything behind and run away?" Jack suggested one day, as we lay on the floor of the workshop, exhausted after yet another passionate encounter. "Run away," I repeated, surprised. "And where would we go?" "Anywhere. Just the two of us. We could start again." The idea was tempting, but also terrifying. I had a life, responsibilities, and more than that, I was afraid of what might happen if everything went wrong. I don't know, Jack. It's a lot to leave behind. He sighed, a mixture of frustration and understanding in his eyes. I know. But think about it. I just want you to be happy. I went home that night with my head full of doubts. With each passing day, the line between guilt and desire became thinner. I knew I was on a dangerous path, but I couldn't find a way out. I desperately wanted to keep Jack in my life, but without destroying everything I had already built with David. Every encounter with Jack made me feel more alive, but also more guilty. The idea of running away with him kept running through my head, but the fear of the unknown paralyzed me. I was torn between two worlds, two loves, and I didn't know how to get out of this emotional crossroads. The only thing I knew for sure was that, with Jack, I felt truly myself. And that was something I wasn't willing to give up, even if it meant living with the guilt and risk of being found out. I was sitting on the sofa in the living room, looking at my cell phone, when Jack's message appeared on the screen. My heart raced. He wanted us to spend a weekend out of town. The idea sounded crazy, but it was also irresistible. I was thinking of a quiet place, just the two of us. What do you think? He wrote. My husband David was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Guilt invaded me for a brief moment, but excitement soon took over. I replied quickly, I'd love to. I'll think of an excuse. After sending the message, I took a deep breath. I needed to come up with a convincing lie for David. I decided that I would say it was a business trip. He had always trusted me, and that made it even easier and more painful. Over dinner, I began my lie. David, the office staff have decided to go on a retreat at the weekend to discuss some important projects. I'll need to travel. He stopped cutting the meat and looked at me with a surprised expression. Oh yeah, where's it going to be? Near the mountains, somewhere quiet so we can concentrate. David nodded, smiling. All right then, just don't work too hard. That night was difficult. Guilt ate away at me, but the desire to be with Jack was stronger. The following days were a mixture of anxiety and excitement. I planned every detail of the trip, making sure that David wouldn't suspect a thing. Finally, the day arrived. I told David that I would be leaving early for the work trip. He kissed me on the forehead and wished me luck. Little did he know that I was about to meet someone else. I drove to the meeting point where Jack was waiting for me. When I saw him, my heart raced. He was leaning against his car, with that smile that always disarmed me. Ready for the weekend? He asked, opening the car door for me. Yes, more than ever, I replied, trying to hide the mixture of nervousness and excitement. The journey was full of conversation and laughter. Jack knew how to make me feel special, as if I were the only person in the world who mattered. We arrived at our destination, an isolated cabin in the middle of the mountains. The place was perfect for a secret retreat. As we entered the cabin, Jack pulled me into a tight hug. Finally, just the two of us, he whispered in my ear, and a shiver ran down my spine. The first night was intense. The passion we felt for each other exploded in a way I'd never experienced before. Every touch, every kiss, was charged with desire. Jack knew exactly how to make me feel alive. Lying on the bed next to him, I stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything. Jack turned to me, stroking my cheek. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how this all seems like a dream, a dangerous dream." He smiled, kissing my forehead. "Sometimes the most dangerous dreams are the most exciting." The next morning, I woke up with a mixture of regret and excitement. I knew I would have to go back to my life with David, but I couldn't stop thinking about Jack. He brought me coffee in bed, and we smiled at each other. No words necessary. As we said goodbye, Jack took my hand. "It doesn't have to end here. You know that." I nodded, not knowing what the future held, but certain that I didn't want that weekend to be our last. Getting home was a challenge. I tried to keep my composure, but every detail of my routine with David seemed different now. He looked at me with love and concern, and I felt increasingly guilty. Jack's messages during the day, however, kept the flame burning. Every text, every word, reminded me of the weekend and what was to come. "You were amazing," he wrote. "You too," I replied, my heart beating faster. I knew I was playing with fire, but the desire and connection I felt with Jack was undeniable. More and more, I wondered how far this would go, and whether I was willing to risk everything to find out. The remorse mixed with excitement the next morning was a sensation I hadn't expected. I woke up in Jack's arms, feeling the warmth of his body and the weight of our choices. The night before had been intense, full of passion and surrender, and now I had to deal with the consequences. I got up slowly, trying not to wake him, but he opened his eyes and smiled. "Good morning, beautiful," said Jack, his voice hoarse with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, feeling my heart racing. "I have to go. David will start to get suspicious." Jack got up too, and while I hurriedly got dressed, he watched me in silence. The tension between us was almost palpable, but there was also a complicity that I couldn't ignore. "It's going to be all right." He came closer and hugged me from behind. "We'll find a way to be together." "I know," I lied, trying to convince myself more than him. "I need to go." I left the room and went downstairs with my heart in my mouth. Every step I took me further away from Jack and closer to my life with David. When I got home, David was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "Hi, love," he said, smiling when he saw me. "How was your trip?" "Tiring," I replied, trying to sound natural. But I managed to sort everything out. David kissed me on the forehead, and I felt guilt creep over me. How could I deceive him like that? But at the same time, the memory of Jack made me want more. It was a vicious cycle, and I was trapped in it. During the day, I tried to keep my composure, but it was difficult. Every time my cell phone vibrated with a message from Jack, my heart raced. His messages were getting bolder and bolder, and I found myself wishing I could be with him again. "I can't stop thinking about you," one of his messages said. "When are we going to see each other again?" I answered quickly, trying to hide the screen of David's cell phone. "Soon. I can't wait." David's suspicions began to grow. He looked at me strangely, as if he knew something was wrong, but didn't want to believe it. During dinner, he finally asked, "Is there something you want to tell me?" "What's that?" I asked, trying to look confused. "You look different. You seem distant. Is something going on?" I felt my heart squeeze. "No, love. I'm just tired. A lot of work, that's all." David nodded, but I knew he wasn't convinced, and I was increasingly torn between guilt and desire. Every meeting with Jack was a roller coaster of emotions. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. That night, after David had fallen asleep, I received a message from Jack. "I need to see you. Tomorrow at the workshop?" I looked at David, sleeping peacefully beside me, and felt a twinge of pain. But the desire to be with Jack was stronger. I said, "Tomorrow, same time." As I lay there, I knew that I was going deeper and deeper into an abyss that I might never get out of. But at that moment, all I wanted was the next time I would see Jack again. I could no longer control the desire I felt for Jack. Our meetings became more frequent, almost as if we could no longer live without seeing each other. With each new encounter, we discovered new pleasures, new fantasies that enveloped us in a whirlpool of passion and lust. I would look at him and see a man who made me feel alive in a way I had never imagined possible. I remember one particular afternoon when we met in a discreet motel on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was simple, but Jack's presence made everything exciting and dangerous. "You look beautiful today," he said, with that smile that made me melt. "Thank you," I replied, trying not to show how fast my breathing was. We kissed with a hunger that seemed insatiable. His hands explored my body, as if they wanted to memorize every detail, every curve. I gave myself to him like I had never done with anyone before. At one point, he stopped and looked deep into my eyes. "I need you more than ever," he whispered. I knew I was losing control, but I couldn't stop. The pleasure Jack was giving me was something I had never experienced before. We surrendered once again, and every touch, every kiss, was like a spark that lit a fire inside me. Afterwards, lying next to him, I felt a mixture of guilt and satisfaction. I didn't know how to hide it from David. More and more, our escapades left traces. A different scent on my clothes, a schedule that didn't match up, the feeling that I was always hiding something. David began to realize that something was wrong. He looked at me suspiciously, but still had no concrete proof. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, David approached me and asked directly, "Is there something you want to tell me?" My heart almost stopped. I knew he was talking about Jack, but I couldn't admit it. "No, why are you asking me that? You've been different, distant. You always seem to have your mind elsewhere." I forced a smile. "It's just work. I've been a bit stressed." David didn't look convinced, but dropped the subject. However, I knew he was becoming more and more attentive. I needed to be more careful, but at the same time, I couldn't stop seeing Jack. With each encounter, the feeling of living a double life intensified. I felt torn between two worlds, and the line between them became increasingly blurred. With every bold message I received from Jack, my heart beat faster. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I couldn't turn back. I felt alive, wanted, and that was something I couldn't ignore. "When are we going to see each other again?" he asked in one of his messages. "Soon," I replied, feeling my whole body vibrate with anticipation. The days seemed to drag on until our next meeting. I made excuses to leave the house, lied to David, and more, the guilt mixed with the excitement of being with Jack. I was living a double life, and the more time passed, the harder it was to hide. On one of our dates, Jack pulled me close and said, "I don't want to hide it anymore. I really want you, completely." I knew he meant it. The desire to be with him was growing, but reality was pulling me back. I had a life with David, a stability that I couldn't just abandon. But at the same time, the passion for Jack was something I knew I would never find anywhere else. "I want you too," I replied, feeling a tear run down my cheek. We kissed with an intensity that seemed to want to erase all doubts, all fears. But I knew that my decision to continue with this double life was leading me down a path of no return. More and more, I found myself caught in a web of lies and desires that seemed impossible to undo. I needed to make a decision, but for now, all I could do was give in to this overwhelming feeling, even though I knew the consequences could be devastating. I woke up that morning with the weight of the world on my shoulders. I knew I couldn't go on living like this, torn between two men. David, my husband, was beside me in bed, breathing softly. Guilt was eating me up inside, but when I thought of Jack, my heart raced. That evening, after dinner, David called me to talk. "You've been different, you know? Is something going on?" He looked deep into my eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew he suspected something, but I had no idea how much he knew or suspected. "I'm just a bit stressed about work," I lied. "Nothing you need to worry about." He nodded, but his gaze continued to follow me around the house. Later, in the bedroom, my cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Jack. "We need to talk. Tomorrow in the workshop. It's important." My heart raced. I knew this moment would come, but I wasn't ready to face it. The next morning, I made up an excuse to David about leaving early to sort something out at work. I drove to Jack's workshop with my hands sweating and my mind racing. When I arrived, he was standing in the doorway, waiting for me. "We need to talk," he said, straight to the point. "I can't go on like this. Either you leave David or we end our affair." I felt a lump in my throat. "Jack, it's not that simple. David is my husband. We have a life together. I can't just throw it away." He looked at me with an intensity that made me shudder. "And what do we have together? Doesn't it mean anything to you?" Tears began to run down my cheeks. "It means everything, Jack. But I'm torn. I don't know what to do." He held my face between his hands, looking deep into my eyes. "You need to decide. I can't live in this uncertainty any longer. Either we stay together for real, or we end it now." The indecision tore me apart inside. I thought about David, our home, our routine. But when I looked at Jack, I felt a passion so intense that it made me forget everything. "I can't lose you," I whispered, almost voiceless. Jack pulled me into a passionate kiss, and there, in the workshop, we gave in to passion once again. The desire was uncontrollable, and every touch, every kiss, seemed like the last. We knew we were playing with fire, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. Then, lying side by side, Jack stroked my hair. "So, you're willing to go through with it, no matter what the consequences?" I nodded, knowing that I was making the riskiest decision of my life. "Yes, Jack. I'm going to stay with you. I can't give up what we feel." He smiled, pulling me closer. "Then so be it. Let's live this passion, whatever it takes." I left the workshop with my heart divided, but my mind made up. The last night of unbridled passion we'd had there had made me realize that I could no longer live without Jack. I was willing to face anything to stay with him, even if I knew that the betrayal would continue and the consequences would be inevitable. I drove home with trembling hands, trying to pull myself together before meeting David. I knew that from that moment on, my life would be even more complicated, but the passion I felt for Jack was stronger than anything else. I was ready to live that double life, whatever the future brought.